proposition is that classrooms should be gender segregated. While the idea of segregating classrooms by gender seems to set back our work on equal rights at the last few decades, it actually has made developmental benefits. Girls and boys develop at different rates in a variety of ways, meaning that integration has a potential to hinder each gender academically. Therefore, we affirm that classrooms should be gender segregated. To be clear, we are arguing for the separate classrooms, not schools. We believe that schools should be integrated in order to allow the two genders to interact with one another in the developmental stages of life. But in order to maximize the learning of each sex, we should adhere to the specific styles of learning that each gender utilizes by separating these classrooms. Our first main argument states that girls and boys learn differently, and there is sufficient evidence to prove that. In the early 2000s, only a mere 11 public schools in the United States had gender segregation classrooms. And by December 2009, this number had risen to over 550 schools. But by even 2014, this number had jumped to 850 schools. There is a reason for this trend. Studies done by the National Association for Single-Sex Public Education has found that not only do the ways that boys and girls learn differs, but even things as small as the temperature in which they are learning in matters. For example, the SSPE, which is the National Association for Single-Sex Public Education, doctrine calls for teachers in male classrooms to be consistently moving and speaking in loud voices, even to the point of shouting, while teachers in female classes should be using a calming tone. This differentiation stems from the central tenet of SSPE ideology that young males thrive on competition and confrontation, while young females require a more nurturing and cooperative learning environment. Boston Globe states that the schools in South Carolina are teaching boys math by taking them outside and by using skateboard parts to teach them math. And teaching of girls, they teach history using a trivia game. This shows that boys are better by going outside and learning the physical things, and girls are more apt to learning from games and from cooperative nature. Main argument 2 states that boys and girls also face the issue of feeling overpowered by the other gender. From a young age, kids are taught that boys are supposed to be successful in more subjects and girls in others. Providing kids with classrooms separated by gender allows them to shed these stereotypes and to thrive as they should and as they could. Chris Raker said that since implementing the SSPE program, fewer boys are being sent to the principal's office. Their overall attendance is up, and they are participating in school clubs in higher numbers. First grade teacher Alicia Wall said that the program is benefiting girls in different ways. Quote, "I definitely see a confidence thing." Wall said, quote, "The girls are ready to learn and ready to work. In co-ed classes, they're afraid to say something. They're afraid to be wrong in front of the other boys." For some, this is why we need single-sex education. The Institute of Physics has pointed out that compared to their peers in mixed schools, females in all-girls schools are more likely to take physics at A level, another notoriously male subject. One hypothesis is that pupils in single-sex schools are less influenced by myths about boys being better at math and science, or girls about being better in English. Research shows that single-sex schools, boys are more likely to see themselves as above average in English, and girls are more likely to view themselves as above average in math, when they usually see themselves as below average with other men. Fewer disciplinary problems would also occur.
4 minutes.
That's fine. I'm good there.
I'll cut this out, but I just want to check, make sure it's still recording.
Yeah, I saw that.
I didn't want to stop it in the middle. Yeah, it's still going.
Okay. Oh, I'm being...
Stand up.
Cross-examination, guys?
Yep. So to clarify, you are arguing that all classrooms should be gender segregated.
Yes.
Okay. And one of your arguments is that this will remove distractions. You've mentioned the overpowering, or they feel threatened by the...
Yes.
Okay, and that comes from an attraction or aversion to the opposite sex?
That is an element of it.
Okay, so you're arguing that we should then segregate classrooms based on sexuality?
I'm not saying that's the sole purpose. That is one of the many different reasons why we should segregate classrooms, but I guess it would be fair to say that sexuality is a part of it.
Okay, so then if there was a gay student, say male, in order to avoid distractions, he would then need to be moved to the female section, correct?
No, because we're not. Are you talking about like the way they feel sexually, like their sexual
Well, you
orientation?
just said that
As in
their
by
sexual
by
orientation.
sexuality. I didn't say sexual orientation. I said by their sexuality. There's a difference there. Their sexuality is how they feel, how like their sex and how they were born, or their gender, which is also a way to put it. Not their sexual orientation. I did not say by sexual orientation.
That's not the definition of sexuality in common language.
Okay.
Sexuality is how.
Well, I should be more specific where they're talking about sexual
Okay.
orientation.
All right, I still have more questions. All right. So then, would teachers need to be the same gender as well as their classrooms?
I would say yes.
Okay. So do you think that would create an issue where in some states or some areas where there's a massive discrepancy between male and female teachers, it would create a large problem with bigger class sizes and students being forced into classrooms with 20 or 30 or 40 kids?
By discrepancy, you mean just like a large number of male teachers
Yeah, look
versus
at the
female,
current
for example.
male to female ratio.
Okay,
What
I
has
just
to
wanted to
be-
clarify that that's what you're asking.
That is 2 minutes, so you don't actually
Okay.
feel into that.
Yeah. Perfect.
Alright, okay, good. I'm still. Oh,
What?
not my turn.
Yes.
Not my turn.
No.
In any democracy, education of our youth is important. We want to create a perfect schooling system that develops well-rounded, intelligent, and thoughtful citizens. As a result, we, as a society, we're always on the lookout for the magic bullet, which will solve all of our problems. Today, it's gender segregation in the classrooms. The affirmative will cite study after study that seems to favor gender segregation as a means to solve every issue of public education. Yet I have a list of just as many studies that refute or disprove each point. From teacher expectations to research bias to even, as Patrick mentioned, classroom temperature, I have a study that explains the benefits that isn't related to gender segregation. I'll reiterate, there's not enough research done on this subject. Additionally, the cost to open and maintain schools, Additionally, the cost to open and maintain new schools for this system is unreasonably high for school districts. Even if some schools were able to avoid building an entirely new and equal but separate campus to separate into only separate classrooms, they would still need to hire staff and pay for specialized training for teachers, something that gender-exclusive schools have issues with today. According to the U.S. Department of Education, fewer than half of teachers in current gender-selective schools are not qualified to teach single-gendered classrooms. To open up to the thousands of schools in the country to this would only exacerbate the problem. Further, we on the negative side take issue with segregating these schools and classrooms on a legal basis. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 states that there shall be no discrimination based on race, color, religion, and sex. Additionally, Brown v. Board of Education unanimously ruled that separate but equal classrooms are still in violation of the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment. The affirmative has stated that they intend to enforce that classrooms be segregated by gender. However, the Department of Education states on their website that gender-exclusive classes, schools, and programs are only legal when, quote, enrollment in a single-gender class is completely voluntary and substantially equal. By removing the choice, the affirmative drives their argument into territory that violates Title IX, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the very Constitution of our country. In summation, While Julia will continue the discussion in her speech, our arguments thus far are such. First, the affirmative has failed to produce substantial and consistent data which substantiates their claims of benefits. Second, the cost to school districts across the country to create curriculum for, hire teachers for, and continually maintain and update is far too high to ask from only scattered data. And third, removing the option for gender-mixed classes violates a slew of anti-discrimination laws in the United States. Therefore, we advocate that you vote negative on the proposition classrooms should be gender segregated. Thank you.
Whenever you guys are ready.
Okay. So would you not agree that potentially paying for the training for teachers to be certified to teach single-sex classrooms would not poses a benefit that's greater than the monetary cost of that if you're trying to create, as you said, well-rounded, intelligent, and thoughtful students?
Well, here's the thing. The U.S. Department of Education has already significantly cut the funding for teachers as is. It's hard to run schools as they are. Trying to create the training for two sorts of education is beyond impossible of the monetary value that the United States has been delegating its teachers and its schools.
Additionally, it might be, you might have a point if there wasn't such inconclusive data. For instance, Patrick, I believe you mentioned, the study that you mentioned was that they learn better. What was the study that you mentioned? I'm sorry.
It's through the National Association of Single-Sex Public Education.
Mm-hmm, but what was the finding of that study?
Which study in particular?
The
The one she was talking about.
yeah.
I'm not sure which one you're speaking of.
Can you be more specific on the issue, please?
Well, never mind. But the point is, there's for every benefit that you guys have, in this list here, I have a study that refutes what you've said, finds either research bias or some negative or some other reason that the finding was such.
Okay, but
Well,
I mean, essentially they just end up counterbalancing each other then, because our sites or our statistics also negate yours.
But so then why would we then pay for this specialized training when we don't know if it will have any effect at all?
Well, it's clearly been shown that there are. I mean,
there's
these
clearly been
classrooms-
shown that there aren't.
Very clearly the classroom sizes are growing, so clearly the other schools are not catching on, would you say? That this is beneficial in one way or another?
It's 2 minutes. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just
Just
trying
making
to
sure.
No, you're good.
gather thoughts.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
So as our opponent stated, the purpose of an education is to create well-rounded, intelligent, and thoughtful students. And their point that their studies negate ours proves that there's just as many studies to prove our points as there is maybe theirs. We don't necessarily need new schools, which they briefly touched on, but wouldn't you agree that paying for the training of these teachers poses a potential benefit that could outweigh not spending this money if we are so creating better students? And again, they also mentioned that the current system makes it so that you can only go to single-sex classrooms or schools on a voluntary basis, but that's the entirety of our argument. We're here to argue that this should no longer be voluntary, that it should be a permanent thing, as it does create better benefits for these students that are put into different classrooms. It's also been shown through the National Association of the Single-Sex Public Education that fewer disciplinary problems do occur in classrooms. A test school, Hawkins Middle School in North Carolina, recently separated the number of office referrals and are continuing to decrease, and that boys tend to get in trouble, usually to impress the ladies, especially at a young age. Also, grades and test scores have been rising in these schools. 11-year-old student at Hankins Middle School was made honor roll for the very first time after making this transition. She says, when boys are around, you become shy, and I'm afraid to ask questions if I just don't understand something. As stated before, Patrick said that boys and girls learn very differently. And if the stigma of gender disappears in young people, they're more successful in the classroom, and they're taught the styles that best fit their particular gender. An integrated school with separated classrooms allows students to socialize with the opposite sex and learn how to work and be around them, while they are engaging with learning materials the way that best suits their needs. It also guarantees equality and allows for classrooms to be equal no matter what. This is because in places that already impose single-sex education classrooms or schools, it's stated that the same opportunities must be provided to girls as for boys or vice versa. This means that the question of equality is no longer an issue because by law, they would be required to be offered the same benefits and same programs. This is one of the many reasons why we affirm that classrooms should be gender segregated. As we also mentioned, this separation is on the rise. In 2002, only 11 public schools in the United States had these classrooms, and by 2009, as Patrick had stated before, this had risen to more than 550. Also, the SSPE programs are now in place at schools in 39 states across the nation and in the District of Columbia, and they're particularly popular within urban districts with large minority populations, usually concentrated to South Carolina, who has 173 single-sex public education schools.
We good?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I'd like to start by saying that I am the only person in this debate who has actually attended a single-gender classroom for a long, elongated period of time. And on top of that, I would go to single-gender and co-ed classes back-to-back, so I can personally attest to the fact that many of the emotional and physical and social traumas that the other side is saying are not true. A schooling career in a single-gender classroom fails to prepare students for interacting with about 50% of the population. Forcing students into a single-gender classroom exacerbates stereotypes and suppresses self-exploration. Since many single-gender classes are taught towards what a teacher believes to be the group's strengths, this is problematic when a boy or a girl does not fit into the stereotypical activities assigned to their gender. Renowned psychologist Rebecca Bigler and her colleagues have demonstrated in various studies that labeling and organizing children by social groups, even randomly assigned t-shirt colors, causes children to infer that the groups differ in important, meaningful ways and develop intergroup prejudices, showing that students will begin to either interpret their gender as superior or inferior. And to give just one example of the implications, it will in turn continue to foster a boys' club mentality in the workforce. In this case of Jane Doe versus the Wood County Board of Education, a mother sued the school district for forcing her 3 daughters into gender-segregated classrooms that eventually turned out to be detrimental to her daughter's learning because of the expectation that was placed on girls to fit into the stereotypical female classroom atmosphere. According to another study, institutionalizing gender-segregated classrooms limits children's opportunities to interact with members of the opposite sex and to develop skills necessary for positive cooperation and interaction. We cannot possibly expect females and males who have gone to separate schools and who have had limited experiences in the classroom with other genders to be able to understand and act effectively in collaboration with the opposite gender in a mixed-sex workplace as people who have constantly been exposed to the behaviors and ideas of the opposite sex. Now let's take a moment just to think about all the students who don't fit into the typical male and female genders. What is the affirmative plan for those students? Would they rather have students, for the purpose of this example, let's say a trans woman, remain in the familiar environment of an all-male class that they have been in for years and stick out like a sore thumb? Or would they rather the person be ripped from what they know and get awkwardly placed in a random classroom of females they don't know well, thereby causing the trans female to out herself from her comfort zone? Even if the affirmative proposes giving trans children the option of what the class they want to be in, does it seem like either of these options is really good for the child involved? This is no way to treat 150,000 13 to 17-year-olds and a growing population of transgender students in America. While the affirmative has stated that separating children is good, it is simply not true. During an average school day,
2
students
minutes.
spend about 6 hours of their 7 hours in the classroom. There's no way to reverse those damages in 1 hour of playtime with the other gender.
It's 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
So to speak on Julia's trans student argument, there are plenty of single-sex public schools that have run into this problem before, and they have all allowed the child or the student to go with of course, the sex that they prefer, and it is something that has been. Okay, here. In recent years, several of the most prestigious, historically all-women's colleges have revised their mission statements to explicitly welcome applications from transgender and gender nonconforming students. In doing so, these colleges are taking important steps to ensure that their commitment to single-sex education doesn't inadvertently perpetuate bias and intolerance. So they accept them with open arms, and they allow them to come in and be a part of the gender or the sex that they feel comfortable with, that they identify with. Also, speak on Julia's proposition that they fail to interact. Again, we are trying to affirm that classrooms themselves should be segregated. She is continually trying to argue that our entire school should be segregated, or argue that she thinks that that's what we're arguing against, which is what we're not. If we have our classrooms segregated, we allow our classrooms to adhere to all of the different ways that our sex is learned differently. But then during recess, during lunch, or different activities, possibly in PE, having schools that have both sexes in them allow the interaction to be there, and allow the interaction between male and female to happen, and allow them to learn about each other. We have also proven multiple times, we've said that these classrooms do not perpetuate stereotypes at all. If anything, it negates it completely. That's the whole point of this, because they do not have the stereotype they can't see the perpetuation of a stereotype every single day in school. And each gender feels more confident in their abilities. And so, yeah, I think it's fine. Yeah, it's so short. So much more to say.
The affirmative has made several arguments. And their essential premise has some merit. They are essentially arguing that studies show that classes learn better and schools do better with these gender-segregated classrooms. Second, that these benefits are worth the costs that will have to be incurred by schools in order to get these benefits. And third, that by arguing for segregated classrooms and not segregated schools, they alleviate some of the questions of further life application, as well as the gender segregation argument, or as well as the perpetuation of gender stereotypes. However, once again, I would like to emphasize that the research they cite is inconsistent, often skewed, and continually disproven. For instance, this study by the British Journal of Sociology and Education shows that there's a strong research bias and cost bias in these gender-segregated schools. The schools get more money, and the teachers are happier not because the classrooms are better, but because they just expect the classes will do better in gender-segregated situations. So there's not any proven benefit to these. I know education is important, and we'd like to do everything we can to ensure that we're doing everything. We're teaching our kids effectively. That said, gender segregation is no perfect solution. At best, it addresses only a small segment of issues in public schooling, and at worst, it asks for significant resources for little payoff. Between the consideration of resources and proof behind gender segregation, the legal implication of segregation and of a separate but equal classrooms, the morality of excluding LGBTQ students, and the unrealistic world it builds for students, we urge you to vote negative. Thank you.
Thank you for watching.
We're done.
Vote us, please.
We're done.
Please.
Oh, that's my